to the Rosenbach podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ames, Associate Curator of the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia. This is Season 2, History Behind the Scenes, in which we explore the Rosenbach's expansive collections connected to American history, journey into the work of the institution to preserve its treasures, and engage in critical conversations about the place of rare books, libraries, and museums in modern-day American civic life. Today, we'll get a unique insight into the remarkably diverse early American history collections at the Rosenbach, which document the multilingual, multicultural heritage of the Americas broadly conceived, and the Mid-Atlantic region of what became the United States in particular. I have a favorite spot in the historic Rosenbach mansion, the southwest corner of what we call the West Library, which was part of Dr. Rosenbach's personal library and is where most of our early American printed books are stored. These shelves hold some of the Rosenbach's best-known artifacts, including our copy of the Bay Psalm Book, the first book printed in what eventually became the United States, published in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1640, and the Puritan John Eliot's translation of the Bible into the Wampanoag language, which was also printed in Massachusetts in 1663. But books connected to early Puritan New England are just one part of Dr. Rosenbach's expansive collection of materials that fill these shelves. Also represented here are artifacts of the Spanish Empire's conquest of Central and South America, as well as Spain's Pacific Ocean explorations, the French exploration and settlement of Canada, and the substantial German presence in the colony of Pennsylvania. This assemblage of books makes clear that the early European experience in the Americas was multilingual, violent, as settler colonizers engaged in warfare with indigenous peoples and worked to stamp out local cultures and religions, and a precursor to the global power struggles of our own time. Today, I'm joined by musicologist Christopher Dylan Herbert for a conversation about the musical traditions of the Ephrata community of German-speaking mystical spiritualists in Lancaster County, which feature in some of the early German-American books housed in West Library. We'll discuss the challenges of uncovering some of the diverse voices that characterized life in this region in colonial times, and to consider how to unlock the history of music and sound from rare books and manuscripts. Let me tell you a bit more about our guest today. Chris graduated from Yale with a BA in Music and Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. He also holds an MA in Middle Eastern Studies from Harvard and a DMA in Voice from the Juilliard School. He is a 2-time Grammy nominee in the Chamber Music Small Ensemble category, and he is a Gramophone Award finalist in the field of early music. For 10 years, he recorded and toured extensively with his ensemble, New York Polyphony. Chris has performed in concerts and operas all over the world. He is an assistant professor at William Patterson University, where he leads the Vocal Studies program. Chris has taught at the Mostly Modern Festival, Amherst Early Music Festival, and Madison Early Music Festival, and has given lectures and workshops at numerous colleges and universities, including Stanford University, Dartmouth College, Columbia University, Duke University, and Eastman School of Music. His dissertation was titled Voices in the Pennsylvania Wilderness, an examination of the music manuscripts, music theory, compositions, and female composers of the 18th century Ephrata cloister. He performed a selection of Ephrata music he discovered during his research in the historic Saal at the Ephrata cloister. In 2020, a recording of that performance was released as an album titled Voices in the Wilderness. Chris, thanks so much for joining me in the West Library for this conversation today. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you, Alex. It's inspirational to be in this room.
For listeners who may be unfamiliar, can you explain a bit about who the Pennsylvania Germans were? Tell us about the early German settlement of Pennsylvania and who the residents of the Ephrata community were.
Sure. So Pennsylvania, among the various American colonies, was a land of religious tolerance, relatively. And William Penn welcomed various immigrant groups, and Germans, specifically those that were persecuted for various Anabaptist or pietist beliefs, made their way to this particular place. Not to say that there were other mainstream people. There were mainstream Lutheran type people that would come as well. What ended up taking place is you would have various groups of different religious groups that would differentiate themselves by different styles of worship or different texts of worship or different ways of dress. And these groups would then find little places for themselves. So Conrad Beissel, who was born near Heidelberg in Germany, he immigrates in his 20s to Pennsylvania, lives for a while in Philadelphia and then Germantown. He is very charismatic, and he sees himself as a pietist. And then he basically decides to set off on his own and create his own little special settlement in a place called Ephrata, which is 15 miles northeast of Lancaster. And in 1732, he establishes his community. He calls it Ephrata, and he attracts at its height about 100 monastic brothers and sisters, and then there are some families that surround the settlement as well. So it becomes this communal space, basically from about 1730 to about 1780. That's the general overview.
And what kind of devotional activities did the residents of Ephrata pursue?
So they changed from year to year. It was very experimental. The idea was that Jesus could come any day, so we need to get ready. And there were various forms of getting ready. But the thing that was consistent throughout was a certain amount of self-denial. They would only be able to sleep 3 hours at a time, and there were very strict rules about what they could eat, which are written down in some of the treatises they wrote. And then the other thing that they did on a regular basis was write hymn texts and compose musical settings for those texts. And there are over 1,000 of them.
How do their musical compositions compare to the work of other German musicians of the 1700s? And how about their English-speaking counterparts in the American colonies? I guess was the musical tradition at Ephrata as unique as their sort of religious lifestyle was?
Yeah, the musical tradition is unique. One thing that we tend to forget about as people in the 21st century is that music was not an easily commodifiable product. It's great. You know, we have a phone sitting right next to me, and I can listen to literally anything that's been uploaded to iTunes Apple Music or Spotify. And, you know, I love that omnivorous diversity. At the time, in the 1700s, if you wanted to make music or you wanted to listen to music, you either had to make it yourself or you had to go to somebody or listen to somebody else do it. So for this particular group, they had no musical instruments and they wanted music to be part of their worship. So they had to write their own compositions, and they used what they knew from what they remembered in Philadelphia and even before in Germany and Switzerland. And so it resembles Lutheran hymnody to a certain extent. It's 4-part homophonic writing. Homophonic means all the words take place at the same time, like a normal church hymn. How it differentiates itself from the more English language, it's more dense. English language music was shape note singing, which a lot of Americans might know about. It's kind of this nasal quality that you'll get from New England. This was not that at all. Ephrata was not shape note. It was much more of a kind of Lutheran vibe.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. We have a physical artifact of this musical culture.
We do.
Sitting in front of us right now. The Rosenbach does not have a huge collection of Pennsylvania German manuscript or print materials. That's really the domain of our colleagues up the street at the Free Library Philadelphia, our book department. We do have a few objects of interest in this regard. And, you know, I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit about the hymnal that we have sitting in front of us. And it certainly seems to me that the Ephrata community was creating musical products. I mean, they were publishing, they were creating the manuscripts that you study. Tell us about sort of the material culture of music as it existed at Ephrata.
Absolutely. So what we're looking at, I have it right in front of me, and so I love looking at this book. It is a 1739 printing by the book printer Christoph Sauer, who was in Germantown. It's called Zionistischer Weihrauchshügel oder Mürrenberg, which is basically like the Zionitic Hill of Incense or the Myrrh Mountain. Very mystical. And it is the first book printed in North America in German Gothic type setting. So it's a particularly notable printing.
Which probably explains why it's in our collection. It's a notable first.
Absolutely. I mean, these go on the auction for over thousands of dollars. So it's a valuable book. It's a collection of text-only hymns. Some are by European authors, Gottfried Arnold or Gerhard Tersteegen, these famous pietist and Protestant hymn writers. And some are by the men and women of the Ephrata cloister, who authored their own hymn texts. And what this text-only hymnal was meant to do, you would hold it in one hand, and then with the other hand, you would read your musical manuscript. And at Ephrata, one of the things everybody did was write or copy music that was original to Ephrata. Mm-hmm. And so majority of the hymn texts in this hymnal in front of me were meant to be sung to original compositions.
Fascinating. And there is a material reason for this somewhat cumbersome duality, right? I mean, can you explain why part of this experience was print-based and part of it was manuscript-based?
Sure. Although music printing was invented in Europe in 1501 by the Venetian printer Ottavino Petrucci, it was not a technology that was easy to transport, and it wasn't something available in Pennsylvania, or the Americas for that matter. Musical printing really got its start in the Americas in the 1800s. And so if you wanted to write music, you had to do it by hand. Mm-hmm. And if you wanted to copy it, you had to do it by hand. So there was no real easy way to be able to present both text and music on the same page unless you were going to create some sort of hybrid where you created extra space on the page during your printing process.
So tell me a little bit about how you happened upon this research topic. As I indicated in my biography, you're a performer, a talented musician yourself. What led you to, well, first just to discover Ephrata and then to decide to focus so much of your life and labor and passion on the music of this unique mystical community?
It all had to do with my doctoral program. So I was studying for my doctoral in musical arts at Juilliard, and you have to have a dissertation topic. And I thought I would do something European, maybe 1500s, high Renaissance polyphony. That was the music that I was performing a lot at the time. And I was talking with a composer who wanted to write a piece for my group, New York Polyphony. And New York Polyphony's agenda at that time when we were working with composers was to ask composers to write in a style that was informed by one of these 1500s composers from Europe. And I said in passing, it's just too bad that we don't have too many American sources at the time. And he said, well, there is one. I was reading this book by Thomas Mann called Dr. Faustus. And in a chapter of Dr. Faustus, he talks about Conrad Beissel, the founder of Ephrata, and his compositional system. I said, wait, whoa, what are you talking about? And I did some research after that, and I realized, there's this large corpus of material that comes from Ephrata, Pennsylvania. The last dissertation on it had been published in 1973. And I ordered this dissertation, and I found some problems with it. And I said, well, okay, this is something I could actually tackle. And the source material is limited. So I wouldn't go forever on it. I could actually set boundaries on my research, and that was really safe.
Smart decision.
Right.
Want to finish one's degree eventually.
And we were only given 5 years to do it at Juilliard, and so I knew that this was I could actually digest the chunk.
What are some of the key things that you learned, and what about this research project most surprised you?
So Conrad Beissel and or his colleagues, it's unclear who authored this, wrote a treatise on composition of music. And it is the third known musical treatise in what's today the United States dealing with composition. The first two are actually copies of British treatises that were published in Boston. So this is very original. And it's this very, very unorthodox system of composition that I have not been able to find replicated anywhere. It's a top-down compositional paint-by-number system. So the idea is if the soprano sings a certain note, then the alto, tenor, and bass are harmonized accordingly based on what mode you're in. So it's very, very just add water. The boom, as long as you know the melody, you can harmonize the composition. And I love the utility of it. It creates a lot of problems because there are some strange moments in the music, which you might hear if you listen to the recording that we did. But that was, I think, the most surprising thing. And then the additional add-on to that is that because our Ephrata cloister was a co-ed monastic system, men and women wrote music. So here, and there are actually women credited for writing music in the various music manuscripts, and that's an exciting find.
Mm-hmm. So to tell me a little bit more about the process of making your album, Voices in the Wilderness, which obviously is a very important product that has emerged from your research. Was it your goal all along to produce an album? Was that sort of the shining star at the end of this whole process? And what was it like to go from archival source material, the material text, in this case musical texts, and really bring it to life for modern ears?
Yeah, so I mean, as a musician, unlike traditional scholars of say history or other fields, whose goal is to write monographs, our goal is to perform, and an album is considered a summation of some of our artistic experience. So it wasn't that I was looking necessarily to record an album of Ephrata music, but I did notice that there had never been a recording. There hadn't been a recent recording that I thought actually honored the music that had been written. And so I had to create editions from the music manuscripts. I had to make a lot of editorial decisions. I had to figure out what do these people actually want. Mm-hmm. So I took a lot of risks in terms of having to translate what is an older style of music notation into a modern style for modern musicians to read. And I had to figure out, okay, is that an eighth note? Or is that on the beat, or is that a pickup? Is this a half note or a quarter note? Is that an F natural or an F sharp? Things like that. And that was an interesting and gratifying process. Ultimately, recording it and hearing the music performed in the hall for which it was originally intended to be performed was also really gratifying.
I can imagine. For the audience as well, I'm sure.
Yeah, we started with a concert and of various people associated with the cloister today, and it was really remarkable. I have to say, though, there is an Ephrata cloister chorus as well, and they're wonderful. It's a volunteer ensemble. I recorded because I wanted to be very efficient. Time costs money, so I hired 4 professional singers to do the gig, and we recorded everything in 2 days.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Ahead of our conversation, I asked you to choose a single piece of music from your album for us to consider as a case study of your research method. Tell me about the piece that you selected for us to listen to, and what it was like to go from encountering this in a musical manuscript, a piece of music with which you were previously unfamiliar, to proceeding so far, increasing your familiarity with it such that you're performing it publicly.
Yeah, I chose the hymn For mir mein Töpfer, and the reason I wanted to present this to you is because it is one of the pieces that is attributed to one of the sisters of Ephrata. This one is Sister Phoebin, or Phoebe in English. I figured out that Phoebe wrote the hymn when I went to the Library of Congress and I saw the Ephrata Codex, which is the largest of all the Ephrata music manuscripts. And I took photos furiously all day long. I didn't really have time to look at any of the inscriptions or the music itself until a few months later. I was going through all my photos and making sure everything was in order. And I realized, that's Phoebin's name, Phoebe's name, next to a musical composition. And I realized that not only her name was there were 2 other sisters in this one particular section of the Ephrata Codex. And after going through all the different threads of logic I possibly could, I realized these particular inscriptions indicate that they wrote the music. So I chose that because it's a novelty. It's the first known notated European female composer in America to write music. It keeps on getting more qualified. Sure, but it's also remarkable because it's emblematic of the Ephrata style. It's 4 parts, soprano, alto, tenor, bass. All of the parts underneath the soprano follow the rules of harmony presented in the treatise by Conrad Beissel or his colleagues. And what's interesting too, if any singers out there are listening to this, you might have sung the setting "Caro mio ben" by Giordano, this Italian composer from the 1700s. It's the exact same melody. I don't think Phoebin knew about this melody. It's a pretty easy melody to compose because it's very scalar, but it was unique to hear.
Nice resonance, fascinating. We will play that piece in its entirety at the end of this podcast.
Fantastic.
So you listeners out there, stick around for it. You'll have a treat, sort of a preview of Chris's album. How has diving into collections of rare books and manuscripts changed the way you think about music and performance? Because, again, as I indicated in your biography, there was a time of your life when archives and libraries and rare books and ancient manuscripts maybe didn't figure quite as prominently.
Not at all.
In your day-to-day experience.
Yeah.
So how has, just at a general level, maybe even beyond Ephrata itself, how has entering this world of places like the Rosenbach sort of shifted your maybe your life in its entirety and your sensibility to music and performance?
The reason I like working with rare books and manuscripts is because I can see the process of creation more clearly. And, when you practice music and you grow up practicing hours a day and you're looking at a modern edition that's been prepared by some editor you don't know, you don't take into consideration why the editor made choices. Is this really supposed to be a fermata at the end? Is this really supposed to be a G natural? I don't know, and I don't care because I'm just trying to do it correctly. And when I went into this research, I realized, there are so many decisions an editor makes that then a performer has to honor. Mm-hmm. And what this allowed me to do was really understand a little more deeply. And now I'll actually try to find the original source. It's great we're living in this age where so much original music and manuscript is online. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I'll actually just go back to the composer's handwriting and say, you know what, I disagree with the editor. Mm. So that was really helpful to be able to go through this process because it gave me a lot more appreciation for the work.
With the distinction between primary and secondary sources. And it sounds like you're very empowered to return to the manuscripts of Bach or Mozart and engage for yourself with this material.
Sometimes, if I have time. Yeah.
That being the key issue. I know you had mentioned previous to the interview that you're working on another little manuscript project at the moment that involves your own family history. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. So my grandmother and grandfather wrote letters to each other during World War II. My grandfather was fighting in Europe. He was in France, Luxembourg, and Germany. And my grandmother was in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And she wrote him one letter every day, and he wrote her one letter every day. And a lot of the letters have been lost. I don't know what happened to them. But a certain number of the letters were all in this red tin. And because my grandfather had ended up in a hospital towards the end of the war, the Army didn't know where he was. And all the letters from March 1945 through May 1945 had been lost. Or they never made it to him. So they were sent back to Grand Rapids and never opened. And they had moved to upstate New York after the war, and they just sat there unopened for years in this little red tin. And they passed from family member to family member, and nobody ever opened it. And so one of my aunts realized, I'm the historian of the family. Oh, do you want these letters? I said, absolutely. So I've opened them all, and I've read them all, and I've transcribed them all. Her handwriting is atrocious. And it's an amazing daily account of a woman's life in a certain period of 1945. It's amazing to read her reactions to VE Day or to the death of FDR or what Truman says about such and such. And it's also amazing to read how much she loves my grandfather, and some of his letters to her are in the box as well. And it's a really remarkable story that I've loved to get to know these people who are now dead. I've gotten to know them better.
What's so interesting about that is that somewhat by happenstance, you have found yourself uncovering women's stories.
Yeah.
From two different eras in American history, very different eras.
I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And you brought a certain sensitivity to it, even though it wasn't necessarily the plan. I'm going to write a dissertation that deals with women's and gender history. I'm going to undertake a family history project that deals with this issue. It's led you there, and you've noticed the importance of that topic.
That's it. Thanks for mentioning that. I hadn't thought about it that way.
Very, very interesting. Chris, thank you so much for this fascinating discussion. I've enjoyed learning more about your approach to early Pennsylvania's complex religious and cultural history and how music fits into the picture.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Rosenbach podcast. Check back soon for another glimpse into the Rosenbach Museum and Library's remarkable collection of rare books, manuscripts, art, and artifacts, and for more fascinating conversations about history, art, and culture. To learn more about the Rosenbach, visit rosenbach.org. We host a variety of on-site and online events and public programs, and always welcome questions from listeners about how to use our collections. Our holdings are always accessible to researchers who make a free appointment to visit our reading room. The Rosenbach's community reaches all around the globe, brought together by our love for history, rare books, manuscripts, and the arts. I hope you will consider supporting the Rosenbach Museum and Library and this podcast by becoming a member today. It's one of the best ways to help us with projects like this. Memberships start at just $55 and give you access to everything we have to offer, online and in person. If you cannot make a financial contribution, please give our podcast a good rating on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to help us build our audience. The theme music for Season 2 of the podcast is a setting of the poem Longings, written by poet, artist, and educator Nellie Rathbone Bright in 1927. Bright co-founded the Black Opals, a collective and literary journal showcasing young black writers in Philadelphia in the late 1920s. The musical version featured here was performed by Yolanda Wisher, Paul Geis, V. Shane Frederick, Mark Anthony Palacio, and Sir Lance Gamble.
I want to flee to a cool
The Rosenbach podcast is supported by a grant from the Evelyn Toll Family Foundation. Thanks again, and I look forward to continuing our conversation about history on the next episode of the Rosenbach podcast.
In the heart of me, drums in my ears, and my lips are wet with the
So